Susan, I have to apologize.
No.
Yes, I keep trying to one-up you on everything. The kids, the house, clothes.
Clothes, come on.
I do, it's awful. It's a bad habit.
Well, I appreciate you admitting that. I always see you as near perfect.
Oh, no. Truth be told, I'm a mess. Yeah, I mean, the kids are struggling in school, and I can't keep the house clean, and I eat a slice of cake, I gain 3 pounds.
You think that's bad? My daughter still doesn't know her sight words. I'm too embarrassed to have anyone in my kitchen, and I gain weight if I so much as smell sugar.
I made cookies last week. I didn't eat them. I just touched them. 4 pounds.
I gained 2 pounds yesterday.
Well, that's not that bad.
While on a fast.
Well, good morning. We're wrapping up a 3-part series today called The Comparison Trap, in which we've been talking about this horrible habit that so many of us have of comparing ourselves to other people and trying to one-up and measure up to what other people are doing and how other people are living. And we even do it in the things we're not doing so well. You think that's bad. And the bottom line of this entire series is this very simple statement. There's no win in comparison. There's no win in comparison, because as soon as I look over and I see what you have, as soon as I start comparing my stuff to yours, my talents to yours, my money to yours, what I drive to what you drive, there's no winning. There's no winning. There's no win. There's no advantage. There's no peace, no finish line. There's no win in comparison. And so we asked ourselves the question, a very, very important question to answer no matter who you are. What or who am I going to look to as my reference point to tell me that I'm okay? What or who am I going to look to as my reference point, my mirror to say, am I doing all right, my standard? Because we all want to know that we're doing okay. Intrinsically, we want to know that the lives we're living are measuring up, that we're doing all right, that we got what it takes, that we're lovable, that we're acceptable. And the question is, what or who are we going to look to tell us that we're doing all right? Because all of us are looking somewhere. We're all looking to something as a reference point, as that mirror to say, you're doing okay, you're good, you're right where you need to be. So if nothing else, if you don't hear anything else today, hear that. This is a very important question to ask yourself. What or who are you going to look to? And so last week, we took that question and we answered it through the lens of the New Testament. And the New Testament teaches that there is a God who loves you so much, and a God who sees you not only as a person, but as a child of His, as a son and as a daughter. And we looked at how you've been invited to relate to that God as Father God. And not as a reflection of your earthly father, but as the perfection of fatherhood love. And then finally, we looked at how you've been invited to view yourself through the eyes of that Father God. View yourself through the eyes of a God who loves you unconditionally. And so the problem is that really any alternative to that is an awful, they're awful. The other options we have are just bad. Because if you're not going to view yourself through the eyes of your Father God, you're going to spend the rest of your life looking for someone as a reference point and comparing yourselves to other people. And there's no win in comparison, as we've said so many times. Hopefully we walk away with that in our heads, that there's no winning in that. Because I tell you, the first thing I do when I'm done preparing this message about comparison, then I walk out the door and I go, wow, that guy's got way more than I do. So if we can get this through our heads, there's no win in comparison. Comparing yourself to other people is a terrible mirror. It's a really bad reference point. And so God has invited you, and this is what we said last week, God has invited you to take your cue about you from the one who made you, loves you, and redeemed you. Not from the people around you, not from your neighbors, not from your friends, not from your enemies, not from your coworkers, but from Him. It's like God says, look, I want you to look into my eyes and tell me if you measure up. I want you to look at me and tell me if you're lovable and if you're acceptable and if you're okay. Quit looking everywhere else. Quit looking at all these other people to find your standard, to find your reference point, because there's no win in comparison. So as we wrap all this up today, this is the last message in this series, we're going to build on what we've said before. Our message title today is 2 Bags Full. 2 bags full, and you'll see why as we go on here. But we're going to look today at a parable that Jesus taught. It's a pretty famous parable. And before we go into parables at all, I mean, probably at least one point or another, we've run into parables in our lives, in our church lives. Maybe we've read some, maybe we've heard some taught. But there are some things that we have to know about what a parable is before we can look at it and understand what Jesus was communicating through it correctly. So first off, and most of you probably know this, but it's important to remind. First off, parables are made up stories. They're made up stories. None of that stuff really happened. Jesus isn't lying when he tells a parable. He's just creating a story. And in fact, parables were actually a very common and even preferred way of teaching for Jewish teachers in Jesus' day, of which Jesus was in the school of rabbinical teaching. And so generally, the next thing we need to know here is that generally parables were given to make one point. One single point. Now, pastors like to take a parable and take every detail. And so here's 8 points from the parable of whatever. But that's not what parables were, okay? Parables were designed to make one point. They were stories that were made up to make one point. It's very important that we remember that for today and anytime we read a parable in the future. Now, the next thing we need to know is that sometimes after telling a parable, Jesus would actually, he would sit down and he'd say, okay, guys, I know you're a little bit confused, but here's what it all means. He would sit down and he would explain it to his disciples or to the audience. But in this particular parable, we're going to be in Matthew chapter 25 today. In this particular parable, Jesus finishes one parable and just keeps going. Parable after parable after parable. And he gives no explanation for any of it. He just keeps going. But if you read the entire section of parables, it begins to make a lot of sense what he's communicating. So remember that as we go on. And the last thing we need to look at here is that when Jesus begins a parable, he often says, the kingdom of God is like, and then he tells a parable, or the kingdom of heaven is like this. And so parables were a way of helping us understand how God views the world, okay? Or more specifically, parables were a way of helping us understand how God views us. And even more specifically, how God evaluates us in light of his will for our lives. So parables, to sum it all up, parables are fascinating, they're very important, and it can be easy to get confused when reading through one. And in this particular parable, and this is important as well, there's kind of a surprise ending. There's kind of a shocking ending to the thing. So I'm just going to remind you. I'll remind you now and I'll remind you again later. Remember that this is a parable, okay? It's a parable. This did not really happen. It's a made-up story that Jesus is teaching in order to make one specific point. And that one specific point that Jesus is making has a lot to do with helping us break out of the comparison trap. So, Matthew chapter 25. This particular parable is known as the parable of the talents. The parable of the talents, and some of you are like, yeah, it's pretty famous, which means some of you are going to know the ending before we get there. If you've grown up in church at all, you'll have heard this at least once. Now, of note here is that the word talent that shows up in most translations, it actually means a measure of money, a large measure of money. It could have been a bag of silver, a bag of gold, but it was a large amount of money, okay? So remember that as we go on, and now that we know all about the darn thing, let's read it. Ready? Okay, we're in chapter 25, starting in verse 14. Jesus says, again, it being the kingdom of heaven, because we're in a bunch of parables in which he's talking about the kingdom of heaven. Again, it will be like a man going on a journey who called his servants and entrusted, and that's a key word here, entrusted his wealth to them. Now, notice he didn't give him his wealth. He didn't just say, here's my money and you can do with it what you like. This master, this wealthy man, he said, look, I'm going on a journey and I'm going to allow you servants to manage my money while I'm gone. And I expect you to do with my wealth what I would do with my wealth. Make sense? So verse 15, he says, to one he gave 5 bags of gold, or 5 talents. To one he gave 5 bags of gold. To another, 2 bags. And to another, 1 bag. And then here's one of the key phrases in this parable. Each according to his own ability. Okay? Each according to his own ability. So in other words, he looked at them like any boss, like any manager, any good company owner, and he said, look at these different people, and he's like, okay, look, you got a lot of talent. You got a lot of talent, so I'm going to give you 5 bags of gold to manage. And then you've got a decent bit of managerial skill, so I'm going to give you 2 bags to manage. And then you get 1 bag of gold to manage. Okay, he looked at them and he said, okay, you guys have got different skills, so I'm going to give you according to your ability. Now, again, this is a made-up story. Remember this. It's a made-up story, but this manager, this wealthy guy, he knows that all the people who work for him don't have the same skill set. So according to their skill, he gave them responsibility to manage. Now, one of the things that we should always ask when we read this parable and any parable is, where do I fit in? And where does God fit in there? And so let's say, just for the sake of argument here, just for the sake of discussion, let's say that you're like the 2-bag guy. You didn't get 5 bags because you ain't that good. You didn't get 1 bag because you're better than that. So you got 2 bags. You're a 2-bagger, which is the life that I live. Okay, and it's a life that you live, because there's always somebody who's got more. There's always somebody who's got less. We've got 2 bags. So let's continue here. We're in verse 16. It says he went on his journey, the rich man. He went on his journey, he left him. Verse 16, the man who had received 5 bags of gold went at once and put his money to work and gained 5 bags more. So this guy took what he was entrusted with. He went out, invested his money, and over a long period of time, because we're going to find out in a moment that a long period of time had passed, he was able to double his master's money, 5 bags to 10. So following the next guy, it says, verse 17, so also the one with 2 bags and gained 2 more. So the next guy did the same thing. He took the 2 bags, he went out, he invested it, he worked it, he traded with it, and next thing you know, he has doubled the amount of money he was given, he was entrusted with. Verse 18, but the man who had received 1 bag went off, dug a hole in the ground, and hid his master's money. And now when Jesus said this, his audience goes, oh, that's bad. Because suddenly we have a pretty good idea how this is going to turn out. Suddenly we know who this is not going to end so well for. It's always the odd man out. So there's this guy, he takes his 1 bag of money, and what's his thought process? I mean, okay, we don't know, because this is a completely fictitious story, and it's silly to decide what his thought process is, but I'm going to tell you anyway. His thought process, he's thinking, okay, look, I've got 1 bag of money. Well, what can I do with 1 bag of money, really? I mean, there's this guy over here, he's got 5 bags, sure. And maybe if I had 2 bags, okay, but I've got 1 bag, come on. So he buries it in the ground. Verse 19, so after a long time. Now, this is important, because if you pay attention to Jesus' parable tendencies, when he says after a long time, it usually means something close to after a lifetime. After a whole life, at the end of a lifetime. So he says, after a long time, the master of those servants returned and settled accounts with them. In other words, he's going to ask them, okay, what did you do with what you had, guys? What did you do with what you had? Here's what happens. Verse 20, the man who had received 5 bags of gold brought the other 5. Master, he said. You see, he couldn't wait for this day. He's like, I can't wait for the master to come home and show him what I did. I doubled this already large sum of money. Look what I did. He said, Master, you entrusted me. There's that word. You didn't give this to me. You didn't even loan this to me. You entrusted me with 5 bags of gold, and see, I have gained 5 more. The master replied, well done, good and faithful servant. You've been faithful with a few things. I will put you in charge of many things. Come and share in your master's happiness. In other words, the master did what any good manager, any good company owner would do. He said, yeah, you know what? You were faithful with the little bit of responsibility I gave you. Now I'm going to give you more. He said, you know what? You were faithful and trustworthy with the little bit I gave you to manage. So man, I love that. I'm going to give you more to manage. So the next guy, verse 22, same thing. The man who had 2 bags of gold also came. Master, he said, you entrusted me. There it is again. You entrusted me with 2 bags of gold. See, I have gained 2 more. And again, the master replied, well done, good and faithful servant. You've been faithful with a few things. I will put you in charge of many things. Come and share your master's happiness. So it's right here that the soundtrack changes. The soundtrack changes and it goes from this happy music to like the Jaws theme or something. The music changes and it's not happy anymore because suddenly, like, the guy who buried his money, he comes running up all sweaty or something because he's been out in the field like, where did I put the, because it's been a long time. Where did I bury this thing? Because he shows up, okay, we're in verse 24. The man who had received 1 bag of gold came in and said, and this is so interesting here, because he's the only one of the 3 that does not start with the phrase, you entrusted me. He somehow lost sight of the fact that he had been entrusted something from his master. And instead, he starts pointing his finger at the master. Before he even starts talking about what he didn't do or what he did do with the money, he points his finger at the master and says, look, now before I tell you what I did do or what I didn't do, you need to know this is kind of your fault. Here's what he says. Master, I know that you are a hard man, harvesting where you have not sown and gathering where you have not scattered seed. In other words, look, I know you're a winner-take-all kind of guy. I know that you're a hardened businessman. You don't leave anything in the margin. You don't leave anything on the table. I know what kind of guy you are. Verse 25. So I was afraid. He said, don't get mad at me. Don't get mad at me, okay? Because look, it's really your fault. Anybody in my situation would have done exactly what I did. So I was afraid and went out and hid your gold in the ground. See, here is what belongs to you. He says, not here is what was entrusted to me. Here is what belongs to you. I'm going to give it back to you in the exact same measure it was given to me. And here's the master's reply. Remember that this is a parable. Verse 26. You wicked, lazy servant. You wicked, lazy servant. The word wicked there in the Greek could also be translated as worthless, which I think might even be a more appropriate translation. You worthless, lazy servant. He's not mad at the servant because he did something bad. He's mad because he didn't do anything. He didn't do anything. He didn't do anything immoral or anything illegal. He just didn't do anything at all. You wicked, lazy servant. So you know that I harvest where I have not sown. And you know that I gather where I have not scattered seed. In other words, look, sure, you know I'm a hard driver. You know I'm a leave nothing on the table kind of businessman. Verse 27, well, then you should have at least put my money on deposit with the bankers, so that when I returned, I would have at least got it back with interest. And nearby, as Jesus is telling the story, his audience is going, yeah, that's what I would have done, at least. This guy was lazy. He didn't even take it to the bank. He dug a hole and put the money into it and just left it there for X amount of years. He didn't see this as something entrusted to him. He didn't see this as something that was an opportunity. He just missed the point of the exercise. Verse 28, so take the bag of gold from him and give it to the one who has 10 bags. He's just being a good boss. Look, okay, you're not going to show initiative with the things that I'm giving you to manage. Fine, I'm going to take your responsibilities and give them to somebody who is going to take advantage. And then the rich man in the parable, he's going to give almost like a weird little sermon kind of thing. He says this in verse 29, for those who have will be given more, and they will have an abundance. And for those who do not have, even what they have is going to be taken away. And to which we say, hey, Jesus, wait a minute, that doesn't sound very Christian. And then verse 30, you ready for this? We're still in a parable. Ready? This is a parable. And throw that worthless servant outside into the darkness, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. To which we go, oh my gosh, he threw him into hell. So hold on, what are you saying here? And obviously Jesus is saying, if you don't manage your money well, you go to hell. So let's close in prayer. Thank you, God, for this time we had together. No, he didn't send him to hell. Remember here, look, this is a story, okay? This is a guy who is rich. He's a wealthy guy. He has no power to send anyone to hell. I don't care how much money you have. Trump can't send you to hell. What does it mean then, okay? What does it mean? It means he says, okay, you know what? You're done. You're done. You're out of my trust. You're out of my inner circle. You had your opportunity and it is gone. Send this guy out. Send this guy outside. And what does weeping and gnashing of teeth means? It's frustration. It is sorrow. And this guy's about to experience some serious frustration and sorrow at the incredibly massive opportunity he just passed over. And Jesus says, well, the rich guy, he's going to say to the guy who didn't even see that he was being entrusted with something, the guy who's going to point his finger at the rich man, the rich man's going to say, you know what, I can't deal with this. These two guys over here, they've got a future. You, weeping and gnashing of teeth. That's your future. And then Jesus, because he is the brilliant communicator that he is, just moves on to the next parable. That's it. You're like, hold on, wait, hold on, Jesus. You got to explain that one. Like, let's take a break, let's pause and, have some crackers and cheese, and you can explain to us what in the world you're talking about. But no, he just moves on to the next parable. Now, when you read the rest of the parables in the section, the point that Jesus is trying to make is really, really clear. I'll tell you what it is. What you have is less important than what you do with what you have. What you've been entrusted with is far less important than what you do with what you have. And here's something, I think this is actually something that we all know somewhat intuitively. If you think about the successful people you know, if you think about the people who started off with a lot, but squandered it and ended up with nothing. If you think about the people who started with nothing, who ended up with a lot. I think we know intuitively that the issue is not what you have, and it's not what you start with, it's what you do with what you have. Make sense? And Jesus says the kingdom of God operates under that premise. So I'll try to illustrate this for you guys. Every one of us, every one of you as persons are made up of certain things. Okay, we all have a certain amount of time. We all have time at our disposal, time in a day, time left on earth. We all have friends. You have connections. You have a family of some sort. You have, maybe it's not a great one, but you have some level of education. You have dreams. You have plans. You have a vision. You have something you want to happen in the future. You have a job, a career, a profession of some sort. And if you don't have one now, you will in the future. You have some measure of money. You have some talent. You have a skill. You have some measure of health. And then you have your story. You have your story, which is something that is completely unique to you. It's not like anybody else's story. And you're this amazing, interesting, unique combination of all of those different things. There's nobody who's exactly like anybody else. There's nobody who's exactly like you, okay? Nobody's put together with all that same list of things in the way that you are. And there's a sense in which that list is what has been entrusted to you. There's a sense in which that list of things that makes up you has been entrusted to you. And maybe you look at what you've got and you like some of it, and maybe there's other stuff that you don't like. Maybe you look at some of it and you go, you wish you could go back and redo it. And maybe you wish you had more time. Maybe you wish you had more money. Maybe you wish you could redo your education. Maybe you wish you had as much talent as somebody else. But it doesn't matter. Because here's what Jesus is saying here. All these things that make up you are not nearly as important as what you do with the things that make up you. What's interesting to me is that our favorite stories, they're not the stories about people who start off with this massive list of great stuff. They're the stories about people who start off with a tiny, pitiful list of things and do incredible things with their life. We love the stories where the person starts off in a bad family, or with no money, or with bad health, or with no particular talents or skills or giftings. And somehow, for whatever reason, they break into some industry, or they become massively, financially successful, or they bless the world with their gifts, or they start some kind of non-profit organization that affects the entire world, or some third world country or something. And we read those stories like that, and we go, wow, they're inspiring. And you know what you'll never read in a story like that? It's a person saying, well, every day I woke up and I just thought about what other people had that I didn't. And every day I would get up and I would just spend my time thinking about the fact that, that everybody has more money than me, and everybody has more health than me, and everybody has a better story than me, and everybody has a better car, a better house than me, everybody has better opportunities than me, and eventually, after doing that every day, I became a success. You never read that. Because successful people know intuitively that it's irrelevant what you have, it's what you do with what you have. That's true wherever or whatever you are, whether you're a Christian or not. But what Jesus implied in this parable, and here's what he insinuated, okay? Here's what he implied. That everything you are, the big list of things that makes up you, to some extent has been placed in your hands by God. To some extent has been entrusted to you by God. Your talents, your money, your position, your family, your story, whatever you've got in that list that's you, is your opportunity to do something spectacular with. Because what you have is irrelevant. It's what you're going to do with what you have that matters. And what's interesting here is to some extent, we get to, or we have to, give an account of our lives to God. We get to say, God, here's what you put in my hands. God, I was born in a poor place where I didn't have much opportunity. That was what was in my hands, and here's what I did with it. Or God, I was born rich. I was born with many, many things put in my hand, and here's what I did with it. God, I was born in a bad family. God, I was born in a good family. God, I was born with bad health, good health. Whatever it is, anything in between. One day we get the opportunity to say to God, here's what you entrusted to me. Here's what belongs to you that you placed in my hands, and I'm going to give an account, not of the things you put in my hands, but of what I did with the things you put in my hands. Notice how the rich man had the exact same level of praise for the man who doubled 2 bags as the man who doubled 5 bags. Do you know why? Because he didn't care what the overall, money he got back was. He said, you took what you had and you did everything you could with it. And that is what I care about. You get that? It's not what you have in your hands, it's what you do with what you have in your hands. So the question is, what are you going to do with the stuff that is in your hands? What are you going to do with that stuff? Because we all have stuff in your hands. Whether you think so or not, you have a load of things in your hands. So what are you going to do with it? And see, every single day, I am tempted to look at everybody else and to look at everybody else's list, the stuff that's in their hands, and say, well, you know what, I'd be better if only I had that. And I could do more if only I had that more money. And I could do this if only I had that house or that car or that opportunity or that job or that family or whatever. And God is saying, it's irrelevant. You understand? It's irrelevant. I don't care that you don't have as much as somebody else. He's never going to compare what you have with what someone else has. He's never going to compare what you have with what someone else has. So the issue isn't what is in your hands. The issue is, what are you going to do with what God has entrusted to you individually? So as we take this entire series and we try to squeeze it down into 2 really simple ideas, they're simply this: that for the rest of your life, you are to take your cue about who you are from the one who made you and loved you and redeemed you. That every single time you're tempted to look to the left and to the right, you say, no. He's not my mirror. She's not my mirror. My neighbor, my coworkers, they are not my mirror. God, you are my mirror. You are my reference point. I'm going to take my cue about me from you, the one who created me and loves me and redeemed me. And then secondly, for the rest of your life, you look around and you celebrate what God has given others and leverage what God has given you. Celebrate what God has given others and leverage what God has given you. God, I'm glad she gets that. God, I'm glad he looks that way. God, I'm glad they drive that. God, I'm glad he got that promotion. God, I'm glad she lost 4 pounds. Whatever it is, but I'm not comparing. I'm going to celebrate what you have put in their hands, what you have entrusted to them. You didn't entrust that to me, but when I get to heaven one day, you're not going to say, well, wait, why didn't you have that stuff that they had? You're not going to ask me about something I didn't have and what I did with something I didn't have. You're going to look at my hands and say, what did you do with the stuff that was in your hands? We're not going to give an account of what someone else did with what someone else had. And we're going to see what's in our hands as something that's entrusted to us as an opportunity. And so while we celebrate them, we spend the rest of our life leveraging what God has placed in our hands. Make sense? That's the big thing, and I can't repeat this enough. The issue is not what we have been asked to manage. The issue is very simply what we're going to do with what God has given us to work with. There's no other way to put it. And I think if all of us would learn how to just tune out the competition, tune out that part of us that says, oh, look at him. Clearly, you're not doing something right. Look at what that person's got. Clearly, there's something off. Clearly, you're not acceptable. You're not handsome enough or good enough or pretty enough, or you don't do this well enough or that well enough. If we tune that out and just say, God, I want to live my life the way you've called me to live my life, not the way you've called them to live theirs. God, I want to manage what you have put in my hands, what you've entrusted to me in such a way that at the end of my life, regardless of how things measure up or whatever, regardless of how I measure up to other people, I'll be able to say, this is what I did with what you entrusted to me. This is how I was able to multiply it with what you gave me. And the alternatives to that are really terrible. The alternatives to that is you're going to try to run someone else's race, to live someone else's life. Some of you are trying to run your dad's race or your mother's race or your boss's race or your neighbor's race or whatever else. Maybe you just need to take a breath, Maybe you just need to take a breath and refocus on what God has given you and not what God has not given you or given someone else. And say, God, in light of what you've given me, how do I best live my life? How do I live my life in such a way that will honor you and bring satisfaction to me? A two-sided coin. And here's what's really cool. Every single one of us, you, and this is not a pep talk or anything, this is just facts. You're a unique blend of the things that make up you. God created you uniquely. So if every single day of your life, every single day of my life, I woke up and said, God, to the best of my ability, all I want to do is walk according to your will, to be and become what you've created me to be. So I'm going to take what you've entrusted me, the good things and the bad things and the hard things and the easy things and whatever, and I'm going to ask you how to show me how to run a race. Ready for this? How to run a race that brings honor to you and satisfaction to me. A race that brings maximum glory to you and ultimate satisfaction to me. It's really cool how God created things that way. If you do whatever is going to bring ultimate glory to him, it's going to bring ultimate satisfaction to you. God didn't make us to suffer. You celebrate what God has given others and leverage what God has given you. Because the alternatives are really bad. At the end of the day, there's no win in comparison. And you think about this concept, and can you imagine what would happen in this church community, or in this city, or in this nation, if even just the Christians would embrace this somewhat intuitive idea? Can you imagine the pressure it would take off of you? The pressure it would take off of your family, off of some of your kids? Imagine how much better your marriage would be if your husband or wife stopped trying to become somebody they're never going to become and just accepted himself or herself for who you created them to be? Can you imagine what a difference that might make? So let's quit it. Let's get out of the comparison trap. Let's wake up every day and say, God, I just want to be who you made me to be. That's it. I just want to take what you've given me and do what I can with what you've given me. And if we do that, that is going to be what brings him maximum glory. Whether it's 5 bags or 2 bags or 1 bag, we take what we've been entrusted and we live it out. That brings blessing to the heart of God and brings ultimate satisfaction to us. Come share in your master's happiness. So we're going to have the band come up here as we wrap this up. We're also going to, as the band plays here, we're going to have some leaders down here at the front. But I'm going to pray to close us out. Father, we live in a society in which we are trained from a young age to compare ourselves to everyone else and find a standard anywhere but in you. God, I pray that what we talked about over these last 3 weeks would settle in our minds and would root itself in our hearts, so that when we walk out of here, the next time we're tempted to take our reference point in someone else and the people around us, we'd say, no, that's not it. I want to see myself through your eyes. I pray that we'd take what we've been entrusted and we'd live it out to the fullest. to bring blessing to your heart, and ultimate satisfaction in our lives. We love you, Father. Amen. The band is going to play up here one last song for a moment. We're going to have some of our leaders here at the front. But if you want prayer, if you'd like prayer for anything at all, we have leaders who'd love to pray with you. And if you're hearing this stuff about Jesus Christ for the first time, and if this is something that you're feeling a pull to try this thing out, I encourage you to take the opportunity and go for it. Respond to Jesus and say, Lord, I want you in my life. I want to start living my life in a way that brings you honor and brings me satisfaction. They call it the abundant life for a reason. So as we have leaders come up and the band will play, we're going to go ahead and